morning. This
Good morning.
morning we're talking to Charles Ozzie Osborne, who was born in Laurel Springs in February of 1924, February 24th of 1924. He's just turned 88, and he has a long history in the town and in the school and as a community servant. And we're going to talk a little bit about Laurel Springs between the wars. What is your earliest memory of living in the town?
Well, mainly my neighbor Bob Taylor was next door. We grew up together, and swimming in Laurel Lake.
Yes.
Uh,
Was there much of a resort left?
oh
in
yes.
Laurel Lake?
Friedenwalder's boathouse was still
Okay.
down there,
Mhm.
and there was still a little boardwalk around the lake
All right.
that we all liked.
Both sides?
Yes, to my knowledge, I believe it was. And I learned to swim in Laurel Lake down at Keener's.
Keener's Pond, or Keener's Landing there, yes.
They had a big tree there with a rope hanging on it and a tire tied to it.
Yep.
And you'd swing out on the tire, and one time I lost my handle, fell in the lake, and decided I'd better start learning
Learn
how
to
to swim. And that's what I did.
Do you have early memories of the school? I know you have later memories because you were on the school board.
Surely. But yes, I remember the school a lot, and it had a lot to do with my life, because we did not have kindergarten at those days, as you well know.
Yeah.
And I was just barely 5, and in their wisdom, they decided that I would skip 3rd grade. I went from 2nd grade to 4th grade. So from that point on, I was always the youngest, the
Right.
smallest,
Yes,
and the least socially adept.
yes.
I caught up educationally around the 7th grade,
Mhm.
but I never caught up beyond being youngest and smallest.
How about that? Who were your teachers? Do you remember any
Sure.
teachers' names?
Let's see, I have that mentioned down here somewhere. Miss Boland, Mrs. Moon, Mrs. Fly, Mrs. Swigert, and Mrs. Rogers was the 8th grade and principal.
I remember Mrs. Fly and Mrs. Rogers. I was about 12 years past you.
Sure.
Yeah. But what was it like going to school in a small town?
Oh, it was wonderful. I mean, we all walked together and had a lot of fun, played together.
Yep.
We did everything together.
Together.
We knew everybody in the school and in your classes particularly, and it was a wonderful atmosphere, much more so when I see the cars parked down at the school now bringing students.
Yes.
I feel so badly for those kids.
They're missing so much.
They most certainly are. Walking back and forth from school
Yep.
was a great time.
Do you remember Papa Berger, Bill Berger?
Oh, most certainly. Everybody in town knows Bill Berger.
Absolutely.
And spent many hours, I guess, down in his fire room, his
Yep.
boiler room, talking. And of course, we all know Bill was so good with the servicemen
Yes.
when we were in the service, and many letters back and forth with Mr. Berger.
He used to come in at 4 a.m. in the morning on a cold day and fire up the coal fires.
Absolutely, I can remember many times going in there to
Yep.
do that.
And he's reported to have written to every serviceman in the town every week.
I believe he did.
Yes, and as kids we would go in and he would have his letters there
Sure.
and his responses.
Yes.
As you progressed through the town, where did you go to high school?
Well, I started in 1936 at Haddon Heights High School. And my dad had, let me backtrack a little bit.
Go right ahead.
My parents and the Whackers who lived on Lindsay Avenue were good friends, and they would often go out on rides. And it was during that time in late 35, early 36, that my dad lost his job. He was a printer in Philadelphia. And he was out for a ride with the Whackers one time, and they were riding up through Easton, Pennsylvania. And he saw a print shop And he said to Mr. Wacker, "Stop a minute, I want to go in and talk to them." And he did, and they came out with a job.
Wonderful.
And so the summer of '36, he worked in Easton, but 5 days a week, and on the weekend he would come home. He'd drive back and forth, and he didn't like that. And he finally got to the point, he says, "We're going to have to move to Easton." So I had just started in Haddon Heights High School, and he came home and said, "We're going to move." And I said, "Dad, you can't do that." He says, "Why not?" I said, "I just learned my locker combination." That was the biggest thing, learning a combination for my locker. And he laughed. He says, "Well, we got to go." So I spent my whole high school years in Easton, Pennsylvania, in Wilson Borough High School. Yep. And it was a great school. I enjoyed it. And about a year after I graduated in 1940, he came home and he said, "We're moving back to Laurel Springs." And I said, "Dad, you can't do that." He says, "Every time I say we're going to move, you tell me I can't. Right. What's the reason now?" I said, "Well, I just have made a girlfriend, met a girl, and have a girlfriend." And that was an exciting thing to me. Sure. It's 16 years old. And so anyway, we moved back to Laurel. So I've been, other than those 4 years of high school, I was in Laurel Springs all my life.
Who do you remember as your friends and schoolmates in Laurel Springs School?
No, well, of course, my next door buddy, Bob Taylor. But in school, Bob was a little behind me, and he was a little younger than I. Al Driver, Ed Jankowski, they were my good buddies going through school. And of course, we only had 12.
Yes.
I've got the list. 12, 7, 19 kids in the class, and we all knew each other well.
Sure.
But again, looking at, I have this record of this class, and I was definitely the youngest one. Some were 3 and 4 years older than I, and I just did not connect with them too well.
Was that like the later days when they had one teacher with 2 classes, 2 grades?
Yeah, I did that for a while. I think in 4th grade, maybe. No, I think Mrs. Fly did 5th and 6th, if I'm not mistaken, and that was the way it went. And yes, they changed a little bit. Miss Boland was in 1st grade, and she had it by herself. I think Mrs. Moon in 2nd was all by herself, but I kind of lost a little bit there when I got moved ahead.
Yes, sure. Tell me about your neighbors, other than the ones you've already mentioned.
Sure.
Who do you remember from around town?
Oh.
People who were active in the community.
Certainly, Mr. and Mrs. Owens lived right across the street from us, longtime residents at Laurel Springs, and Mr. Owens was very active in the St. Paul's Presbyterian Church. Mrs. Watt lived across the street or next door to Owens. Joe Rienzi and his wife lived right up next door to Taylor's. McGovern's, Lang, Mrs. Helmright, Mr. and Mrs. Mabel, not Mabel, Hable,
Hable.
right on the corner of Elma and what was then Lindsay. We I guess Linden,
Linden, yeah.
and we called it, and now it's Stone Road.
Yes.
So all those neighbors were all very, very good friends, and I knew them all. And
do you have memories of Dr. Stone?
oh, absolutely.
Dr. Stone delivered me.
Really?
Yes.
How about that?
100 years ago or so.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
And did Dr. Stone have offices down on Laurel Road? At the
Yes, he ran the hospital for a short time. I believe it was in the Stafford building, which is now YMCA. And many women who were going to have children went into the hospital just before birth. And he had an office on Fairmount Avenue, just off of Linden, which is now Stone Road.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Dr. Stone was our family doctor until Dr. Brown came to town.
Yep.
and then Doc Brown was with me from that time on.
Since you were very connected over the years with the town government, what do you remember about the town government? Is there anyone who stands out, or is there any special program that stands out, or
Well,
group?
I think that I always felt the town was very well governed, and my dad was somewhat involved in politics, but I remember way back, I think the mayor was Haggerty, and then when we moved to Easton, I kind of lost touch with that, but then when I came back, and when I right in the service, and then I remember Carl Caldwell, and Carl had a lot to do with
Yes.
moving the town ahead, I think.
Yes. Thinking of the business section,
Oh, yes.
people are aghast when they hear that we had the number of stores that we did and the amount of shopping locally that we had. It was quite common in those days. What do you remember about the business section and the people who ran things?
Well, one of the big things on Washington Avenue was Euchre's store, candy store.
Yep.
We all knew to go over to Euchre's at break from school, lunchtime, and that
was
sort of.
the double building?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. Right next to where. What do you have?
It's just one or two buildings up from the barber shop
That's
on the
right.
same side.
Exactly. But the business area was,
Yep.
Sam's store,
Yep.
and Denby's had
Yep,
their
yep,
store. Mr.
right.
Marshall had a store, the hardware store.
Mhm.
Mr. Davidson was a butcher,
Yes.
and they're the kind of things you remember, and
Sure.
their stores are all pretty much there.
Yep.
They've changed many times.
Gus's barber shop.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And many of them are not in the greatest of shape.
Well, they're trying to do a couple
Yep,
good ones right
yep,
now.
Yep, they've redone, I don't know who was in the original Baker's, right
I
on the
don't
corner.
know. All I
because-
remember is Baker's.
Yeah, because that building was in bad shape, and it's
Yeah.
been redeveloped.
And I understand it's going to be an ice cream store.
That's
which is
what I hear.
wonderful,
Yep.
because we never had an ice cream
right.
store in town.
I
as such.
remember going to, was at the time Artie's sweet shop, and he had a soda bar,
Oh, yeah.
and all of the kids would go there after school.
Well, also the soda bar next to the theater, the Laurel Movies,
Yep.
It was a drugstore, and that was where I first found out what sodas were.
Yep. There you go.
Ice cream soda
Right.
and
Yep.
plain soda
Yep.
for 5 cents.
Yep. What do you remember about the movie house and some of the movies of the day?
Oh, well, of course, the most thing that stands out about the movie is the big time, and I was young at the time, but the Mischief Night time with the cow was
Yes.
drawn across the stage and interrupted the whole movie.
Yes.
But we'd go to the movies. That was a big thing, and of course that was well documented over
Yep.
town's history. But always going to the double features, and my wife, who was a town resident and is no longer living, but she was a couple years behind me. But when she was a kid growing up, she would go to the movies
Right.
and get, every time she'd go to the movies, she'd get a dish,
Yes.
depression
Oh,
wear,
yes,
as
yes,
we call it.
yes.
And we still have it. My kids are very much interested in.
They've become quite collectible,
Yeah.
the movie depression wear dishes.
And Barb used it well, and now my youngest daughter Pat, she's very much interested in having that, and does.
Sure. What do you know about the drugstore that was immediately next to it, between the movies and the barber shop, as part of the movies?
Well, that was. I can't remember the name of the man that.
No, I can't come up with it either.
As I say, I remember going there many times for ice cream and sodas and things
Yep.
like that.
What was in the other side? Because there was a store that on each side that flanked the movies.
I think there was a shoe store, and that was, to the best of my knowledge.
Yep.
Again, not remembering names.
Now, names are tough. Do you remember any of the merchants along Atlantic Avenue there?
Well, certainly, as I said, Sam Oliveri was that?
O'Teary.
O'Teary, that's
O'Teary,
it, yeah,
yeah.
O'Teary.
Yep.
And Mr. Marshall,
Right.
Mr. Denby,
Yep.
and that's about
Remember Joe who had the shoe repair shop in there?
it. Oh, sure. Joe is he still around?
Joe passed a couple of years ago at 95.
I saw Joe not too many years
Yep.
back.
Yep. He was active up until his last year or so.
Great guy.
Absolutely a great guy. It used to be kind of a hangout for the adults. They would go in there and everybody sat along the chairs and talked to Joe and
Yeah.
shot the breeze and all of the rest of it.
Of course, I lost some of that time when I was in the service.
Yes. Yes.
And shortly thereafter, when I came home, I was immediately married to Barb Ross.
Yep.
And she and her family lived on Washington Avenue all her. It was strange with Barb. She lived on two houses in her whole life. She lived in Washington Avenue and Lindsay Avenue, and that was it. There's not many people can say
That's true.
in their whole life, only live in two buildings only a couple blocks apart.
We're surprised at the number of really long-term residents in the community.
No,
Because
certainly.
we expected maybe 10 or 15, and it's more like 50 or 60.
And amazing.
And you also have the houses used to go up for sale and be sold to somebody in the neighborhood
Oh,
or their
yes.
children.
That's true.
Yep.
Yes.
How about the farms in the area?
Well, of course, let's see, I have that on
We
there.
had Rexon and Johnny Stafford.
That's right. Rexon's and Stafford, the only farms that I knew
Yep.
of. And, of course, we used those for hiking and
Sure.
all kinds of
Yep.
things.
But people today don't seem to realize that this was a pretty rural community.
Oh, surely.
And most of the people commuted back and forth to work in the city by railroad.
That's right. I did that myself.
Yep. Tell us about the trains.
Well, the thing that I remember about the trains specifically as a child, coming down through town, you naturally always heard them coming along. Two tracks
Yep.
instead of one as we now have. Our Sunday school, I went to Sunday school at St. Paul's from the time I was 3 or 4 years old, right on up. And every summer we would take a trip to Wildwood for a summer Saturdays, and
Yep.
riding down on the train was a tremendous big thing.
I bet.
Yes, yeah. Except you have the window open, you would get down there, you would be a little shade darker because of the soot
Sure.
coming in.
Yes, yes. They were steam, and they blew steam and soot all over the place.
And a lot of people don't remember the bridge that was over the railroad at Maple Avenue.
And tell us why.
Well, it was a large hump
Big hump bridge, yes.
bridge over to make room for the trains to pass through. But and the trains would go by with their smokestacks spewing out sparks, and it caught on fire one time.
Yep.
And it burned pretty badly. It didn't. I don't think it burned completely, but it was
Yep.
decided that had to be taken down after that.
I was told that it was built when the railroad went through in 1877 to give the people at the Stafford farm on Maple access to the other side
Sure.
with their cows. It was mostly truck farm type of a farm, but it allowed them to get their cows back and forth.
Well, of course, when I was a kid, there were cars that were being
Sure.
used too then.
Yeah.
And I would hang out. I was only a block away from where I lived, and I would walk up to the bridge and come down and watch trains come
Sure.
through and all. It was an exciting thing to do.
Do you remember the watchmen, the two or three people who manned the watch boxes over the years?
No, that I do not remember.
I remember Harold, who was from Winslow, and Bertha, who was there during World War II, who wanted to be an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And all the kids would hang out there. Center of town was a center of town.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thinking along, what organizations were you in the town?
Well, as a youngster, I was in the Scouts, of course, and we would meet in St. Paul's, down in the basement. It was always a wet.
Oh, yes.
that lower room down
Yep.
there, whenever we got any kind of rain, it was always a wet
Right.
floor. I can remember doing lots of Scout activities down there
Yep.
with wet feet, and they certainly over the years corrected that, thank goodness.
Did you do any camping with the group?
Not that I recall, no. See, the thing was, just as I was getting to Scout age was when I moved to
Right.
Easton, and I did.
Yep,
I was
exactly.
involved in Boy Scouts
Right.
in Easton too. And as I grew older, I was certainly always involved in the church.
Right.
But I also I'm a longtime member of the Masonic Lodge.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was a master of the lodge back in 1929, and all I heard growing up was
Sure.
the Masonic Lodge.
Can you give us a little history of the Laurel Lodge?
Well, yes. Again, that was after I came home from
Right.
the service. I had two brothers who were almost 12 years older than I. They were twins, Bob and Bill.
Yep.
And they wanted to join the lodge, knowing that Dad had
Sure.
been involved in it. And they decided, well, let's wait. The war came along. Let's wait and see what happens, and wait until the kid gets old enough. They always called me the runt.
Yep.
I was a little one.
Right.
And they said, let's wait till the runt gets old
Yep,
enough,
yep.
and then we can all do it together. So we all three of us, joined the Masonic Lodge as
Right.
three at the same time. And the interesting part about it was that my dad, as master, did all the degree work, and that was after I knew what
Right.
had been done. I couldn't imagine what a tremendous job he did.
Yes.
As in tremendous lot of work and memorizing and things like that, and the degree work.
When did the lodge start in Laurel Springs?
Well, I think it was Mr. Stack was the first master, I
Al
believe.
Stack's father.
Al Stack's father.
Yeah.
And he was first master in 1922. So I would assume that the lodge
Somewhere in that
somewhere
period, right?
around the
Yep.
1920 or something like that.
That was also a period of expansion of the town. People don't think of it, but Laurel Springs was a housing development community, particularly on the east side. And a lot of the houses were built right after World War I, and they were being populated by people who wanted to get involved in the town, and they got involved in things like the fire company, the Masonic Lodge, the churches.
Certainly.
It was very, very active life throughout the town.
And you mentioned about the lodge. Somewhere in the late 40s, early 50s, we had a fire, and that was pretty well burned up at that time. My brother Bob was going through the chairs at that time, and he was master in 1953, I believe, and he was very involved in helping to rebuild and get that back to the shape that it's in.
If you look at the town today, what history pops out at you? Things that are still there that were there in your youth?
Well, I had written that down somewhere. I mentioned one thing that everybody remembers in Laurel Springs, but the cow being brought
Yes,
across
yeah. Do you
the stage.
remember the two firehouses?
Oh, surely. Absolutely.
Since it's no longer there, what do you remember about I think it was number 2 that was over there at next to where the Whitman Stafford farmhouse
That's
is.
exactly right.
Was
yes.
the barn.
Yep. Yeah, the firehouse number 2 was on over there on, is that Maple now? No, it's
Yeah, East Maple.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it depended where you lived,
Yep.
which fire company would service it if you had anything. And I remember growing up very much in awe of the men that worked in the fire company, because they were so much civic minded.
Yes.
And when they would have their uniforms on, they were impressive bunch of men.
Yes.
I remember Al Myers and
Yep.
Mr. Alexander
Yep.
and all those gentlemen that used to work hard to protect the town, and they did.
Yes. You remember Fire Company number 1?
Surely.
And
Over on now Stone Road.
Stone Road, right? Most people don't even realize that.
Elm Avenue, I
Elm.
think it was called.
Yeah, the one, the last transition before it became housing was Arlene's Sweet Shop.
Absolutely, yes.
But, yep.
Another good spot that we used to
Yep.
use all
Yep.
very well.
There are a lot of little shops sprinkled around the town, because a lot of people worked out of their home because they were craftsmen.
Mm-hmm.
And you had a lot of people who would come in by train, and goods would come in by train. Trucks weren't common in those days.
No.
And when the train would come in, you'd have a whole bunch of people downtown. It was really, really interesting.
Well, you mentioned the train going to Philadelphia. Of course, we only went to Camden,
Right. And then
hopped on the ferry, and
Yep.
went across, and I did that going to work many times.
do you remember the horse-drawn carts from Camel Soup?
One of the first jobs I had was at RCA Victor, and that was right next door to Camel Soup.
Right,
And I can remember, as a young man before I went in the service, Camel Soup, all the carts coming in bringing the tomatoes, and smelling the tomatoes cooking.
Yep.
We used to, at lunchtime, there was at RCA, there was a park out there, Johnson Park.
Yes. Yep.
And we
Still there.
It's still there,
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
And we would go out, have lunch out in the park, and just take a break, and it was dancing and everything going on at that time.
As a matter of fact, RCA's #1 recording studio was a church down near the waterfront.
Really, I did not know
Yeah,
that.
And they would do their Gold Seal records, or their Red Seal records, which was their top brand.
Yeah, surely.
And artists from all over the world would descend on Camden, and they would do their recording there,
Yeah,
because the
that's it.
acoustics were supposed to be perfect.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a lot of fun working at RCA in those days. I didn't dare that too long, because that was
Yep.
shortly before I enlisted in the service and went in the Air Force.
Tell us about what was happening in town just before the outbreak of World War II and the responses of the youth.
Well, of course, the things that happened was gas rationing came
Yes.
along.
A, B, and C tickets.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And I remember that was a big thing for me when I was in the service, because I was stationed at Millville Airfield for two months.
Yep.
My girlfriend Barb was here in Laurel Springs. My dad, out of the goodness of his heart, gave me his car to use while I was down there. He went without a car. And I had to get gas stamps to drive back and forth. Practically every night I would drive home
Yep.
here to Laurel Springs to see my girlfriend. Her family had a man who was on the gas rationing board in Millville.
Yep.
And I would go over to him, and he would give me stamps. But other things that you said, mentioning, of course, we were all so much concerned with buying bonds,
Yes.
stamps, everything that we could.
We bought stamps in school.
Sure.
10-cent savings stamps, and if you really had money, you could buy 25-cent savings
Yes.
stamp.
It was, everybody just was so much pushing together to want to help in the war effort. And it was, again, a town-wide effort that everybody was, people that had a son in the service would very proudly put a flag in it with a star on it in the window.
Do you remember the Duns with 5 stars?
Absolutely,
Yep.
sure. The Duns had a big family and really
Absolutely.
helped.
Yep. I remember talking to Bud Myers, and right at the start of the war, a lot of the local guys got together and they went up in mass to the recruiting station and signed up.
Yes.
And I don't recall where they sent them.
Well, what I did, when I was 18, I had always, well, from childhood on, I wanted to fly. 5 years old, we were down in Stone Harbor for a vacation, and there was a fella flying an open cockpit biplane off the beach. There was no boardwalk at that time. He was flying and landing off the beach, and the whole time we were on vacation, I begged my dad, please take me up. He was scared to death. He didn't want to have anything to do with any flying machines.
Right.
But the last day we're there, my mother said, why don't you take the kid up? So he asked the pilot, he said, can you take both of us? He said, yeah, you're both small. You can let the little boy sit on your lap. Took us up and flew around Stone Harbor. And when I saw what the ground looked like from the air, how beautiful it was, I said, that's what I want to do. And we would, in later years, drive up to Central Airport, Airport Circle in Camden, and watch the planes come in and land. My dad would take me up there, and we would sit there and watch the big Ford Trimotors come in. It was
Early DC-3s.
That's right. And all these things led to me to wanting to fly. The war came along, and I thought, well, maybe now there's a chance I can do it. But to be, at that time, pilot training, you had to have 4 years of college. Well, I hadn't even just barely gotten out of high school. Did not go to college at all. And then they needed so many, they cut back the regulations, and they said, we'll take them if you have 2 years college. And then they said, okay, if you can take a test that passed that's equal to 2 years college. So now was a spot that I could perhaps get in. I went to Woodrow Wilson High School for about 8 months studying 2-3 nights a week.
There's dedication for you.
Things that we needed to be able to pass the test. We went, and this was in 1942. About 330 of us went up to the Armory in Camden and took a day-long test. Half of it was physical, half of it was a written test. Out of that 330, that day, that they gave us the answers of the test right there before we left. So out of that 330, about 130 of them passed, and I was one of them. And out of those 130 that passed the test went into aviation cadets, as it was called, only 30 of us ended up as pilots. So it was rather rigorous to be able to do it.
What was the first plane you flew as the pilot?
Well, that was a Stearman, PT-17 Stearman. It was a open cockpit biplane.
Had to be a thrill.
Oh, it was a great plane. And it was a long time before I ever got to be flying, because they took us through, we went to what they called a college training detachment. I was sent to the University of Buffalo for 6 months, and then went to classification center where they decided whether you were going to be a pilot, bombardier, or navigator. And then you went to pre-flight school, and then you finally started to fly. And it was forever, but it was wonderful. I loved it all.
Once you were a pilot, where were you shipped to?
Well, after I graduated from flying school, they asked you what type plane you wanted to fly. Well, everybody wanted to be a fighter pilot.
Absolutely.
There's no question, but everyone could not be a fighter pilot. but luckily I was chosen to go into a single-engine fighter pilot's school. But everyone also wanted to fly P-51 Mustangs.
Oh, yeah.
It was a glamour ship of the Air Force.
Absolutely.
And in their judgment and wisdom, they sent me to learn to fly a P-47 Thunderbolt, which was, in my mind, the best thing that ever happened to me, because it was a great ship. I really enjoyed that. So I learned to fly the 47 in Camp Springs, Washington, D.C., which is now Andrews Air Force Base. And then we went from Camp Springs to gunnery school, and that happened to be Millville, New Jersey. Spent a couple months there, and then we went back to Richmond, which was our home base, and they decided we were going to go overseas. Got on a transport with a convoy of about 55 ships, and landed in England, and then slowly worked our way over to join the group that I was assigned to, and I joined the group in Belgium, and we moved rapidly. Then, as the frontline troops were moving, we moved with them. So I was in Belgium, Holland, and then Germany, and we did close support with the frontline troops, which was the plane was built for high altitude escort. We were using it for low altitude dive bombing and strafing, but it was very rewarding because you could almost see the good that we were doing. We knew if a bunch of fellas were being trapped by a couple of tanks, we could go down and hit them and knock them out, and giving them some real relief, which was very rewarding.
We've talked a lot about all kinds of interesting things here. Is there anything that you'd like to bring up that I've missed?
Well, you mentioned about on the questionnaire here memories of 4th of July celebration in town.
Yes, tell us about some of the local celebrations.
4th of July was an absolutely fantastic thing in Laurel Springs. Everyone would come together for the parades, for the games, and so afterwards, and then the fireworks at the end of the day. Oh, it was an absolutely wonderful part of the town, and everybody would be involved in it. It was wonderful. And I have to, a big part of growing up and later on was the church. St. Paul's Church was and is a wonderful place. And some of my good friends in early days were the McEwens.
Oh, yes.
Mr. McEwen was the pastor at the church at that time. I was married in the church, and Mr. Emmons was the pastor at that time. And I've spent my whole life there and been involved in it. You mentioned the Board of Education. Between church activities and Board of Education, that's practically my whole adult life.
Very busy.
Yes.
But you were doing significant things in the town.
Yep.
Well, we thank you so much for your time and your interest, and we'll be doing this for the next probably year and a half as we prepare and celebrate the centennial of Laurel Springs. And we're always looking for new people to interview, and if you have anybody, give us a call.
You mentioned one of the questions, we mentioned Dick Rutherford and his sister Elsie. Ellen Davidson, I don't know whether Ellen's on your list.
Ellen's now Salati.
Yeah, surely.
Yeah, I talked to Ellen, and she will be...
and her brother, Joe Davidson. He's down in Lewis, Delaware.
Right.
And I don't know whether any of the McGoverns are left. I think there are one or two.
I'm sure they're around, but they're pretty well scattered.
Joe Dunn.
Yeah, we're in the process of trying to catch up with Joe Dunn. Yep.
Nancy Bax, of course. Nancy Sackelbin.
Yep.
And Whitney Myers, I mentioned.
Yes.
I went over to Whitney after I got my list of classmates, and he and I were in class together.
Mhm.
One of the things I mentioned going through school, we formed a football team.
Oh,
And
I have a picture of a Laurel Springs football team.
And one of the things, this was in 8th grade, and we had jerseys with our
Yeah.
names on the back.
Mhm.
We were professional football players, we
That's
thought.
right.
And Whitney and I played together.
How about that?
And there were a lot of things that went on in town were
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah, absolutely. Neat little town.
And I appreciate you folks, the people that are going with this thing to try to find some information about it. It's a wonderful thing that you're doing, and I appreciate it so very much.
Our long-term plans, once we are done and put this together, we want to give a copy to the county library, the county historical society, and other groups that preserve history.
Have you been in touch with the school, Dr. Brown, at all? I mean,
I've been in touch with them, but we have not. We're dealing with two groups: the World War I, World War II group, and then the after World War II, the 1975, and most of that is after that. So the information we're picking up from schools are the people who went to school here
right.
and have memories.
Well, there's very few of my classmates that are living anymore. As I mentioned, Al Driver and Ed Jankowski were my buddies. Fred Huffner, I don't know where Fred lives
No.
anymore, if he's around, but Whitney Myers is the only other one.
Yep. Where is Al Driver now?
Al Driver's passed
Oh,
on.
he has passed,
He
yeah.
was a very active lawyer in Camden
Yes,
County,
yes.
and Al lived in Haddon Heights,
Yep.
I believe, but he has passed on.
Yep.
And Evelyn Larson, Evelyn Fessel, her name is, and but I understand she's not real well. But I believe she's the only one. I don't know about Mary Jane McNally. McNally's lived down on the far end of Stone Road.
Yeah.
I haven't seen or heard about her for
No.
some years. But Florence Kane, one of the many Canes, and
Yes.
they're all distributed around. Now
Yes.
Roy, the son of Roy,
Yep.
and he's been very active in town and still is.
We're working our way through the town. It's kind of a neat exercise.
I'm sure it is. It must be an interesting job that you're doing.
Oh, it's a fascinating job. And not only that, in most cases, one of us is sitting into the control room, and the gentlemen there, Mike and Bob, are also long-term residents, and their memories are back. And we should tape that too at the same time.
Everybody has different feelings and
Exactly,
different memories.
exactly.
And
It's really kind of neat.
yeah,
Oh, we thank you for your time,
I appreciate it
Yeah.
very much.
and we'll give you copies before you leave.
Excellent. Thank
Yep.
you so much.
Okay.